Hello, everyone. This is Dr. David Bassano. There are several problems in the field of international relations which are particularly thorny. The permanent state of war between the two Koreas, for example. Also, Taiwan, Kashmir, and Western Sahara. But the most intractable problem in international relations is that of Israel and Palestine. In this talk, I'll try to give you all the basic information needed to make sense of the recent fighting in the Gaza Strip, as well as the status of the other occupied territories. In the interest of time, I'll leave out many aspects of Israeli history, like their international relations and most domestic politics, in an effort to focus on the Palestinian question. The root of the problem is a political theory and later a movement known as Zionism. For most Jews, this is the concept that Jews should have an independent state in the area once occupied by the ancient Jewish kingdoms of Israel and Judah. When those kingdoms were conquered between 800 and 500 BC, most Jews emigrated elsewhere in the Middle East and then eventually later to Europe. The Jews, as a distinct ethnic group, became a nation without a state. This meant that most Jews, with their own culture, religion, and language, were cultural foreigners wherever they lived. Zionism grew in popularity in Eastern Europe in the 19th century when the Tsars carried out pogroms against the Jews, generating the sense that the only way the Jews could remain safe was to have their own country. The new country was to be created in the region of the old Jewish kingdoms, now known as Palestine, a name derived from Palestina, or the land of the Philistines. That's the Latin name given to Judea by the Romans. Zionism, incidentally, comes from the name Zion, one of the hills in ancient Jerusalem. In the 19th century, the majority of Jews in Western Europe were not Zionists. They preferred integration into their local European cultures. The main problem with creating a Jewish state was that Palestine had been ruled by the Ottoman Empire since 1516 AD. The Ottoman Turks had captured the region from the Mamluk Empire when they were on their way to conquer Egypt. Palestine was a part of an Ottoman district known as Ottoman Syria. Although Zionist leaders approached the Ottomans about acquiring land in Palestine, the Ottomans were, unsurprisingly, not interested in giving away a province to foreigners. Later, they did permit some immigration to Palestine, but with no intention of letting the province declare independence from the empire. Fast forward to World War I, when the Triple Entente fought against the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. In March 1916, the UK made a deal with Arab leaders who were under Ottoman rule. If they rebelled against the Ottomans, the UK would grant the Arabs their independence, because the UK expected to occupy the area after the war. There is debate over whether or not that deal included what is now Israel and Palestine. In November of 1917, during the war, the British government announced the Balfour Declaration, the first statement in support of the Zionist cause by a major nation. It was designed to win the support of Jews worldwide to the Allied cause and had the support of Zionist leaders. It stated that the British government, quote, views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, unquote. The British had now made promises for independence to the Arabs and for a new Jewish state to the Zionists. How they meant to keep their promises to both sides is debated. They may always have meant to set up two states in Palestine, one Arab and one Jewish, although that is what neither the Arabs nor the Zionists understood the declaration to mean. The Arabs took the deal and fought alongside British forces against the Ottomans, expelling them from the Middle East by the end of the war in 1918. See Lawrence of Arabia for the full story there. What they didn't know was that the UK and France had already secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which would divide much of the old Ottoman Empire between them. The League of Nations approved this scheme after the war. The French and UK were to rule these mandates until such time as they were ready to rule themselves. The French took what eventually would become Syria and Lebanon, while the UK took Iraq and Palestine. The Arabs considered this a betrayal of the previous agreement, which guaranteed independence. The Zionists now insisted that the UK, which now controlled Palestine, follow through with the Balfour Declaration and found a Jewish state there. They, too, were disappointed. Zionist immigration to Palestine, which had been continuous even during the Ottoman Empire, was already causing disputes in Palestine as Zionist immigrants and Palestinians fought over land and water rights. The British had great difficulty in keeping peace between the two sides. Then, in 1939, the British changed tack again. The increasing probability of a major war in Europe prompted Britain to focus on Arab goodwill to prevent the fascists from getting access to Middle Eastern oil. This caused them to curtail Jewish immigration to Palestine. The result was the 1939 White Paper, which restricted Jewish immigration to only 75,000 people over the next 5 years. Zionists considered it a betrayal of the Balfour Agreements. Nevertheless, through both legal and illegal immigration to Palestine, the Jewish community, which was fewer than 100,000 in 1919, numbered 600,000 by the end of World War II. The Arab Palestinian population was roughly 1 million by then. At this point, neither the Palestinians nor the Zionists trusted the British to keep their promises. The Second World War and the Holocaust drastically changed the appeal of Zionism in Europe. These twin tragedies left the remaining Jews in Central Europe as refugees. Almost all wanted to leave Europe, and many opted to seek refuge in Palestine by an organized clandestine effort. A steady, illegal boat lift ensued, carrying Jews to Palestine without the necessary documents. This massive immigration caused further tensions between Palestinian Arabs and Zionist settlers in Palestine, and the British, responsible for order in the region, took countermeasures against the illegal immigrants. Resistance to British rule increased on both sides. In 1946, escalating tensions exploded into violence again. Zionists and Palestinians murdered each other and both attacked the British. Although by this point the British wanted to leave Palestine, they did not know how to do it without a bloodbath ensuing. The negative publicity generated by British attempts to halt Jewish migration to Palestine led the U.S. Congress to delay granting Britain the economic aid it so desperately needed after the war. Since the UK seemed unable to handle the situation, the UN appointed a committee to decide how to deal with Palestine. This was the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, or UNSCOP. In September 1947, UNSCOP recommended partition in Palestine. This authorized the creation of two nations, one Arab and one Jewish. This is known as the two-state solution. Incidentally, Jerusalem is holy to Jews, Muslims, and Christians, so it was decided that the city would belong to no country, but be administered by the UN, so that all religions would have unfettered access to it. That eventually was not to be. The Palestinian Arabs, unwilling to give away their land to foreigners, refused the partition plan. Concerned that carrying out the plan would severely damage Anglo Arab relations, the UK refused to cooperate with the UN plan. Rather than partition Palestine, they decided to simply withdraw from the region and let the cards fall where they would. The final evacuation was to be completed May 1948. Fighting between the Arab and Jewish communities of Palestine began immediately after the UN decision to partition. Fighting spread as the British gradually withdrew. Up to 150,000 Palestinian Arabs either fled or were evicted in the fighting. However, this civil war was about to become much more complicated. The Arab League was founded in Cairo in 1945 by Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Transjordan, known as Jordan after 1946, and Yemen. The purpose of the League is to help Arab nations act in concert in matters of common concern, because disunity had always been a problem in the wider Arab community. In solidarity with their Palestinian Arab brethren, the Arab League declared that they would greet any attempt to form a Jewish state in Palestine with war. The League could not invade before the British withdrew, but planned to invade the day after the British finished their evacuation. On May 14, 1948, the last British forces left Haifa, and the Zionists declared the founding of the State of Israel. Both the US and the USSR immediately recognized the new state. Several Arab League nations, including Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, promptly invaded the new state of Israel. Although they outnumbered the Zionists, now properly called Israelis, the invading armies were poorly trained and equipped, while Israeli forces included many well-armed veterans of World War II. To the surprise of the entire world, the Israelis won and secured a ceasefire in March 1949. More than 6,000 Israelis were killed and 30,000 wounded out of a population of only 780,000. On May 11, 1949, the new state of Israel was admitted as a member of the United Nations. While Israel controlled one-third more territory than the original partition plan, it did not control all of Palestine. Jordanian forces occupied the west bank of the Jordan River, as well as East Jerusalem. The coastal region, known as the Gaza Strip, was a protectorate of the Arab League. You've probably heard all these names before. Over 700,000 Palestinians left the region by 1949, some voluntarily, some forced out. This represented about 85% of all Palestinians who were never able to return. Palestinians who stayed in Israel, about one-sixth of the Israeli population, remained under martial law until 1966 and were sometimes forcibly relocated away from sensitive areas. The Arab nations still consider themselves in a state of war with Israel despite the ceasefire. Arab resistance to Israel was sparse and uncoordinated until May 1964 with the formation of the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. This group called for self-determination for Palestinians, the right to return to their homes, and eventually for an independent Palestinian state within the original mandate. It carried out terrorist attacks and hijackings against Israel from their bases in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, as well as from within the Gaza Strip and West Bank. The next Arab-Israeli war came in May 1967 with the Six-Day War. In response to Arab preparations for an attack, Israel launched preemptive airstrikes against the air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. This gave Israel a major advantage in the subsequent ground war, in which the Jewish state defeated the armies of all three attacking nations. The major outcome of this conflict was that Israel now occupied the Golan Heights of Syria, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. These areas are known as the occupied territories. This brought another 1 million Palestinians under Israeli control. East Jerusalem is the most complicated sticking point in Israeli-Palestinian relations. It contains most of the holy sites of the city, and all Abrahamic religions want access to it. It was occupied by Jordan after the 1948 war and taken by Israel in 1967. Israel considers it annexed, while most of the international community and the United Nations consider it to be occupied Palestinian land. After the Six-Day War, the United Nations Security Council immediately passed Resolution 242, calling on Israel to leave the newly occupied territories because, although the nation had a right to defend itself, acquiring land through conquest is considered illegal under international law and destabilizing to the region. Israel and the Arab nations agreed with the resolution, though the PLO initially rejected it because it said nothing about the rights of Palestinians within Israel. The Israelis did not, at this point, leave the occupied territories. It is important to note that Israel did not annex these territories either, except for the Golan Heights, but only exercised control via military governors. The Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank became an integral part of the Israeli economy as they commuted to work in Israel by day and returned to the occupied territories at night. This also began the process of settlement, a controversial issue in Israel to this day. The Israeli government assisted its citizens in building housing complexes and communities in the occupied territories. The government's motivation was increasing control over the territories by filling them with Israeli settlers. Perhaps one day it might be able to claim that they were primarily Israeli and then formally annex them. The settlers themselves were largely motivated by religion, believing that it was their mission to settle all of Palestine and bring it back under Jewish control. These settlements not only occupied Palestinian lands, but also separated the remaining Palestinian holdings from each other. The final Arab-Israeli War came on October 6, 1973. Known as the Yom Kippur War for the day it began, this surprise attack by Egypt and Syria saw some initial gains for Arab armies before the Israeli Defense Forces rallied and pushed them back. The war was costly to both sides and convinced them that negotiation was the only practical option going forward. The most direct manifestation of this came 4 years later, when Egyptian President Anwar Sadat changed course and decided to recognize the legitimacy of Israel and its right to exist. This opened the door to diplomatic relations between the two countries and meant that Egypt could no longer legally invade Israel unless it was first attacked. Needless to say, this was an extremely controversial view in the Arab world and earned Sadat the disdain of ardent Arab nationalists who still wanted an independent Palestinian state. Sadat was assassinated in 1981 by Islamic fundamentalist members of the Egyptian army, who were not ready to make peace with Israel. Subsequent peace talks aimed at granting the occupied territories a certain autonomy under Palestinian rule. These faltered despite the engagement of the United States in the peace process. Yasser Arafat, leader of the PLO, offered to stop terrorist attacks if Israel offered a path for the occupied territories to become an independent Palestinian state. The U.S. therefore recognized Arafat as the main negotiator on behalf of the Palestinians and entered into talks with him. The administrations of Jimmy Carter and George Bush Sr. were both deeply involved in the process. Since Islamic terrorist groups use the occupied territories as a hot button issue, peace between Israel and the Palestinians would go a long way towards bringing the temperature down and disempowering the Islamist terrorists. However, the situation in the occupied territories began to decline. First, Israeli settlements continued in the occupied territories, their populations now totaling about 100,000 people. This led to increased tensions between Israeli settlers and local Palestinians, while the Israeli administration sought to clamp down on Palestinian protests. Combined with a declining economy and a sense that the diplomatic process was deadlocked, the tension exploded in 1987 in the First Intifada, or uprising. This was a series of riots against Israeli rule, featuring Palestinian youth throwing rocks at Israeli police and military. The most important development of the First Intifada was the birth of Hamas, a group which, at least initially, fought for a Palestinian state throughout the original British mandate and for the destruction of Israel. While talks in Washington progressed slowly, the Israeli government secretly entered into talks with Arafat in Oslo, Norway, considering him to be the only leader who was able to bring peace on the Palestinian side. This effort bore fruit in September 1993. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat signed the Declaration of Principle on Palestinian self-rule, the first agreement between the two sides and the first step in what became known as the Oslo Accords. The second treaty, the Cairo Agreement on the Gaza Strip and Jericho, was signed in May 1994. The Oslo Accords came down to this: a 5-year period of self-rule for a Palestinian government, first in Gaza and the city of Jericho, and then in the remaining areas under Israeli military rule. It did not provide for an independent Palestinian state, but was widely considered to be a first step in that direction. Israel recognized the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. For its part, the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist, renounced terrorism, and agreed to change the portions of its charter that called for Israel's destruction. Thorny issues such as borders, the return of refugees, the status of Jerusalem, and the Jewish settlements in the occupied territories were reserved for final status talks. The U.S. approved of this agreement, even though it had not been involved in the process, and pledged economic aid to the new Palestinian National Authority, as the interim government would be called. The Golan Heights, incidentally captured from Syria in 1967, is not part of the Palestinian National Authority, since it was originally under Syrian rule. That area has been the subject of de facto Israeli annexation since 1981. Not everyone approved of this deal. Conservative Israelis, especially in the nationalist Likud party, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, rejected the deal as anti-Zionist. Israeli settlers also opposed the deal. Palestinians who wanted to destroy Israel and replace it with a Palestinian nation, encompassing the entire original mandate, also opposed the peace deal. The Islamic group Hamas, which sought the destruction of Israel, was particularly strong in the Gaza Strip, and it launched a series of terrorist attacks against Israelis after the treaty was signed. Yitzhak Rabin paid with his life for his efforts. In 1995, he was assassinated by an Israeli religious fanatic who viewed the peace process as anti-Zionist. Shimon Peres, Rabin's successor as prime minister, proceeded with the peace process. At first, the progress was encouraging. Arafat was easily elected the first president of the Palestinian National Authority, and most Palestinians now lived under its authority. However, Israel had not yet removed its troops from the occupied territories, and Hamas launched a campaign of suicide attacks against civilians that angered Israelis and dampened enthusiasm for the peace process. Furthermore, Netanyahu's government continued its settlement program in Jerusalem against the wishes of the Palestinian Authority. Arafat, in retaliation, released Hamas activists from jail and suspended security cooperation with Israel. He even threatened to unilaterally declare Palestinian statehood. A new election in Israel, however, brought Labor candidate Ehud Barak to the office of prime minister, and Barak promised to renew the peace process. Barak continued the peace process with Arafat, but East Jerusalem became a major sticking point in negotiations. East Jerusalem contains the Temple Mount, believed to be the site of the original temple which Solomon erected to Yahweh. It is presently the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the most holy places in Islam. Many Arabs believe that Jerusalem must be the capital of a future Palestinian state. Its importance to both religions makes it the greatest point of contention in Israeli-Palestinian relations. Arafat refused to share East Jerusalem with the Israelis, demanding nothing less than full Palestinian sovereignty in East Jerusalem. This earned him applause in the Muslim world, but stopped the peace process in its tracks. The breakdown led to violence in the West Bank, known as the Second Intifada, which was infamous for the killing of a 12-year-old boy by Israeli forces. However, an opportunity arose to continue the peace process. First, Arafat's death in 2004 led to a moderate Palestinian leadership which was more willing to negotiate. Second, Israel pulled the last of its troops from Gaza in 2005, reducing tensions there. The new possibility of peace was disrupted when Hamas defeated the moderate Fatah party in the 2006 Palestinian Authority elections. This was viewed not so much as a triumph of Hamas's extremist ideology, but rather as a repudiation of the Palestinian Authority's notorious corruption. The two parties formed a short-lived unity government. This was followed the next year by a military coup by Hamas, which seized complete power in Gaza. Hamas then launched attacks on Israel from the Gaza Strip, and Israel retaliated with strikes aimed at Hamas militants. On the other hand, the Fatah Party, a moderate offshoot of the PLO, retained control over the West Bank, the largest of the Palestinian territories. Due to its more moderate nature and willingness to negotiate, the Israeli government considers Fatah to be the legitimate Palestinian National Authority. Months of negotiations between Israel and Hamas broke down in 2008 when, in response to rocket attacks from Gaza, the Israelis launched airstrikes against Hamas bases in Gaza, followed by a ground war which killed over 1,000 people. That conflict ended after 3 weeks with each side declaring a unilateral ceasefire. The progress towards two-state solution stalled after that. The Palestinian Authority demanded that all settlements be suspended, but the Israeli government, under Benjamin Netanyahu, refused to stop the developments in East Jerusalem. The Palestinian Authority then considered asking the United Nations to declare the Palestinian areas an independent state, but the U.S., at the behest of Israel, threatened to oppose any such action at the UN. In 2012, another round of rocket attacks from the Gaza Strip hit Israel, prompting airstrikes against Gaza for several weeks. The same occurred in 2014, with the Israeli army this time entering Gaza to destroy Hamas terrorist infrastructure for several weeks before withdrawing. The situation in Gaza remained tense, with large-scale protests against Israel. The situation in Gaza exploded once again in October of 2023. Hamas militants from Gaza attacked Israel, killing 1,300 people and taking over 200 hostages. This triggered a full-scale invasion of Gaza by Israel, killing at least 60,000 people wounding another 150,000 and decimating the entire region. At the time of this writing, a ceasefire is in place but shows little hope of holding, with each side violating the agreements. Several investigations indicate that Israel's disproportionate response may be labeled as genocide against the Palestinians. Most nations of the world, not including the United States, now recognize the Palestinian state. Returning to the peace process, the two-state solution, from the current situation is a daunting proposition. Gaza lies in ruins, and Israeli settlers continue to expand in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Palestinian economy is in tatters. This is not a recipe for moderate politics, and Hamas has been very good at leveraging the resulting anger. It is likely that years or even decades will be needed to return to the promise of a two-state solution.